I still remember the day I stumbled upon the Atlantean Gardens like it was yesterday. As an archaeologist, I've spent my fair share of time exploring ancient ruins and hidden artifacts, but nothing could have prepared me for the eerie fascination that gripped me as soon as I laid eyes on those twisted, overgrown hedges. I had been tracking a lead on a long-abandoned temple deep in the heart of the desert for weeks. My team and I had finally pinpointed its location, and we set out to uncover the secrets hidden within its crumbling walls. The blistering sun beat down on us like a malevolent force as we trudged through the sand, our footprints the only signs of life in an otherwise desolate expanse. As we approached the temple, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air seemed to vibrate with an otherworldly energy, and I could have sworn I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, a flicker of motion that vanished as soon as I turned to look. My team laughed it off as paranoia, but I knew what I'd seen. This place felt haunted. It was then that we stumbled upon the entrance to the Atlantean Gardens, hidden behind a tangle of thorns and vines. The massive stone door, adorned with symbols that seemed to writhe like living serpents, loomed before us like a monolith to madness. I felt an inexplicable pull, as if the garden itself was beckoning me closer. I pushed open the creaking door, my heart racing with anticipation and trepidation. The air inside was heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying flowers. A faint hum, like the reverberation of 1,000 whispers, seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves. I knew in that moment that I had entered a realm where the laws of reality were about to be rewritten. The garden stretched out before me like a twisted tapestry, its pathways winding and treacherous. Tomes, bound in human skin and adorned with symbols that seemed to burn with an inner fire, lined the walls. The air was thick with an unnatural silence, as if the very creatures that once called this place home had been silenced by some ancient curse. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what lay ahead. I knew that I was about to uncover secrets that were meant to remain hidden. And so, with a sense of morbid curiosity, I stepped into the heart of the Atlantean Gardens. I stepped into the garden, my eyes adjusting slowly to the dim light. The air was heavy with an otherworldly presence, as if the very fabric of reality had been warped and twisted within these walls. Every step I took seemed to echo through the silence, like a solitary drumbeat in a realm where time itself was distorted. The architecture of the garden was a labyrinthine nightmare, twisting paths that led nowhere and buildings that seemed to shift and writhe like living things. I felt as though I was navigating a surreal dreamscape, where the laws of physics were mere suggestions rather than hard and fast rules. As I walked, the air vibrated with an electric tension, like the anticipation before a storm breaks. The trees loomed above me, their branches tangled in ways that defied all logic, their leaves whispering secrets to each other in a language I couldn't understand. Every step revealed a new terror, a new wonder, a new reason to question my own sanity. I felt like a puppet on strings, manipulated by some unseen force that delighted in toying with my perceptions. The garden seemed to be playing tricks on me, hiding and revealing things at will, like a sadistic game master. And yet, despite the creeping sense of dread that threatened to overwhelm me, I couldn't look away. I was transfixed, drawn deeper into this twisted realm by some morbid fascination. As I walked, the sky above began to darken, as if night itself was being drawn down upon us like a shroud. The air grew colder, heavy with the scent of decay and corruption. I knew then that I had entered a world where the boundaries between reality and madness were about to become blissfully irrelevant. As I ventured deeper into the garden, I began to notice strange creatures flitting about the edges of my vision. They were unlike anything I'd ever seen before, twisted, nightmarish beings that seemed to be crafted from the very plants themselves. A tendril of vine wrapped itself around a gnarled branch, and then suddenly elongated into a sinuous, pulsing limb that seemed to move of its own accord. I watched in horror as it writhed across the ground, leaving behind a trail of squirming, insect-like creatures that scuttled after it like ants on a feast day. The air was thick with an otherworldly scent, a sweet, floral aroma that was both alluring and repulsive at the same time. It was as if the garden itself was exhaling a breath of putrid, decaying matter, and yet somehow, paradoxically, I felt drawn to it. As I walked, the plants around me began to change, their shapes shifting and morphing before my very eyes. A blooming flower suddenly unfolded into a grotesque, nightmarish visage, its petals twisted into a snarl, its center pulsing with a malevolent glow. I stumbled backward, my heart racing with fear, as the garden seemed to come alive around me. The plants reached out with thorny fingers, tangling themselves around my ankles and wrists like chains. I tried to shake them off, but they held fast, their grip like a vice. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything went still. The creatures ceased their writhing, the plants stopped their twisted dance, and the air grew silent once more. I stood there, frozen in terror, waiting for anything to happen next. As I ventured deeper into the garden, my eyes began to scan the walls for any signs of life or meaning. And then, I saw them cryptic symbols etched into the stone, like a madman's code scrawled across the surface of an ancient tome. They seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, as if they were alive and watching me with cold, calculating eyes. I reached out a trembling hand to touch one of the symbols, feeling a shiver run down my spine as my skin made contact with its rough, stone surface. The symbol seemed to sear itself into my brain, like a branding iron burning a message into my very soul. I saw visions of dark rituals and human sacrifices, of ancient deities and forbidden knowledge. The symbols seemed to be telling me a story, a twisted tale of how this garden had been created, and the terrible price that had been paid for its beauty. As I continued to explore, I found more and more symbols, each one revealing a piece of a dark and sinister puzzle. They spoke of an ancient civilization that had once flourished here, a people who had worshipped dark gods and practiced forbidden rituals in this very garden. The symbols hinted at a terrible tragedy, a sacrifice made by the inhabitants of this garden, a sacrifice that had been repeated countless times over the centuries. And now, it seemed to me, I was trapped in the midst of it all, forced to bear witness to the darkest secrets of this twisted and forsaken place. As I delved deeper into the garden, I began to experience vivid visions and flashbacks, as if the very fabric of time was unraveling before my eyes. I saw glimpses of an ancient civilization, one that had flourished in this garden centuries ago. I saw them tending to the plants, their faces twisted in ritualistic chants as they offered sacrifices to dark deities. I saw them dancing under the stars, their bodies adorned with intricate symbols that seemed to match the ones etched into the walls. And I saw them suffering, their eyes filled with a deep and abiding despair, as they realized too late the terrible price they had paid for their dark rituals. The visions were fragmented and disjointed, but one thing was clear. This garden had been the epicenter of an ancient cult, one that had sought to summon powers beyond human comprehension. I felt myself being drawn into the past, as if I was becoming a part of this long-forgotten civilization. The air grew thick with an otherworldly energy, and I could feel the weight of history bearing down upon me. I saw a figure in the distance, a woman with skin like alabaster and hair like black silk. She beckoned to me, her eyes filled with a deep sadness. And then everything went dark. When I came to, I was back in the garden, standing before the same symbol that had started it all. But something was different. The air felt charged with an electric anticipation, as if the very fabric of reality was about to tear apart. I knew then that I had been given a glimpse into the past, a glimpse of the dark secrets that lay hidden in this garden, and I knew that I would never be able to escape its grasp. I walked through the garden, my senses on high alert as I scanned for any signs of danger. And then I saw them, a group of people who seemed to know me, but whose intentions were far from pure. There was a woman with a warm smile and piercing green eyes, who introduced herself as Sophia. She seemed friendly enough, but there was something in her gaze that made my skin crawl. Next to her stood a man with a charming grin and a handshake that felt like a vice grip, introducing himself as Marcus. He seemed confident and self-assured, but I sensed a darkness lurking beneath his polished exterior. As we walked through the garden, they chatted easily about everything from the weather to their favorite books. But every now and then, I caught them exchanging knowing glances that made me feel like an insect under a microscope. They seemed to be discussing something in hushed tones, but I couldn't quite make out what it was. The air grew thick with tension as we walked, and I began to feel like I was trapped in some kind of sinister game. Sophia's eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, I saw something there that made my blood run cold, a glint of malice, a hint of malevolence. She smiled and patted my arm, but it felt more like a warning than a gesture of friendship. Marcus chuckled and clapped me on the back, his handshake feeling like a physical grasp on my very soul. I tried to extricate myself from their conversation, but they seemed determined to keep me by their side. As we turned a corner, I caught sight of something that made my heart skip a beat, a small door hidden behind a tangle of vines. The door was slightly ajar, and I could have sworn I saw Sophia's hand slipping inside, as if she was beckoning someone to come out. I felt a shiver run down my spine as Marcus followed her gaze, his eyes fixed on the door with an unnerving intensity. I knew then that I had stumbled into something far more sinister than I could have ever imagined. The protagonist's grip on reality begins to slip as they encounter increasingly bizarre and disturbing sights. As I walked through the garden, I started to feel a creeping sense of unease. The plants seemed to be closing in around me, their tendrils snaking out like grasping fingers. Sophia and Marcus were still by my side, but their smiles seemed to be growing wider, more sinister with every step. We came to a clearing, and in the center of it stood an enormous tree, its trunk twisted and gnarled with age. The branches seemed to be reaching up towards the sky like skeletal fingers, and I could have sworn I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, a figure darting between the leaves. Sophia reached out and took my hand, her touch sending shivers down my spine. "Come closer," she whispered, her voice like a rusty gate. "We're almost there." I tried to pull away, but Marcus's grip on my arm was like a vice. He pulled me forward, his eyes gleaming with an unnatural light. The tree seemed to be growing taller, its branches stretching out like arms to embrace me. I felt a sense of awe creeping over me, followed by a growing sense of dread. Suddenly, the leaves began to rustle and whisper, the words indistinguishable but the malevolent intent clear. The air was thick with an otherworldly energy, and I could feel my grip on reality beginning to slip. Sophia's face was inches from mine, her breath cold and rank. "We're here," she whispered, her voice like a sigh of despair. And then everything went black. When I came to, I was lying on the ground, my head throbbing with a dull ache. Sophia and Marcus were standing over me, their faces twisted into grotesque grins. "Welcome to our world," Sophia said, her voice dripping with malice. "You'll never leave." I tried to sit up, but a wave of nausea washed over me, forcing me back onto the ground. I was trapped in a living nightmare from which I might never awaken. The last thing I saw was Marcus's face, his eyes blazing with an unholy light as he whispered, "You'll never be sane again." As I lay on the ground, trying to make sense of what had happened, I began to notice strange noises and movements in the shadows. At first, I thought it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, but then I heard the faint sound of whispers, soft and raspy, coming from the walls themselves. It sent a chill down my spine as I realized that I wasn't alone in this place. The whispers seemed to be coming from all around me, echoing off the stone floors and walls. I tried to focus on Sophia's face, but she was just out of reach, her features blurred by the darkness. Marcus, on the other hand, was standing right next to me, his eyes gleaming with an otherworldly light. He reached out a hand and touched my cheek, his fingers cold and clammy. "Don't worry," he whispered, his breath hot against my skin. "We'll take care of you." I tried to pull away, but he held me fast, his grip like a vice. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, and I felt a presence closing in around me. It was as if the shadows themselves were moving, twisting, and writhing like living things. I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, a figure darting across the wall, its presence flickering like a candle flame. The air was thick with an unseen malevolence, and I knew that I was in grave danger. Sophia's face loomed larger, her eyes black as coal, her skin deathly pale. "Come," she whispered, her voice like a siren's call. "Let us show you the secrets of this place." I tried to resist, but Marcus's grip on my arm was too strong. He pulled me to my feet, and together we stumbled into the darkness, the whispers growing louder still. We moved through a maze of twisting corridors, the shadows closing in around us like a shroud. Every step felt like a betrayal, as if I was surrendering myself to some ancient evil. And yet I couldn't look away. The presence grew stronger, more palpable, until it felt like it was going to swallow me whole. Finally, we arrived at a door made of dark wood, adorned with symbols that seemed to shift and writhe like living things. Sophia pushed the door open, revealing a room filled with an unholy glow. In the center of the room, a figure sat on a throne-like chair, its back to us. The air was heavy with anticipation, and I knew that we were about to face something truly terrifying. As we entered the room, I was met with a sight that made my blood run cold. The figure on the throne-like chair slowly turned to face us, its back to us just moments before. Now it was face to face, and what I saw was a twisted mockery of humanity. Its skin was deathly pale, pulled taut over its skull like a drumhead. Eyes that glowed with an otherworldly energy stared back at me, their pupils vertical slits that seemed to bore into my very soul. The mouth was a twisted rictus grin, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth that seemed to be stained with the remnants of previous victims. Sophia stepped forward, her eyes locked on the figure's face, and I could see the madness creeping in. She reached out a hand, as if drawn by some unseen force, and touched the figure's cheek. It didn't flinch, but instead leaned into her touch, its eyes never leaving mine. Marcus followed suit, his own hand reaching out to join Sophia's. The two of them seemed to be drawn into the figure's presence, their faces alight with an unholy excitement. I tried to step back, but my feet felt rooted to the spot. The air was heavy with malevolent energy, and I could feel it crawling up my legs like ants on a summer's day. The figure slowly rose from its chair, its movements stiff and unnatural. It towered over us, its presence filling the room like a dark cloud. Sophia and Marcus stood transfixed, their eyes still locked on the figure's face. I was the only one who seemed to sense the horror that was unfolding before me. The lines between human and non-human began to blur, as if the very fabric of reality was unraveling. The figure's skin seemed to ripple and shift, like the surface of a pond disturbed by a stone. Its eyes flared with an intense light, and I felt my mind reeling in response. I tried to speak, but my voice was frozen in my throat. The only sound was Sophia's gentle whisper, her words barely audible over the pounding of my heart. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "Isn't it?" The figure's face twisted into a grotesque parody of a smile, and I knew that we were doomed. As I stood there, frozen in terror, the world around me began to distort and blur. The figure's face seemed to ripple and shift, like the surface of a pond disturbed by a stone. Sophia and Marcus were still transfixed, their eyes locked on the figure's face, but I felt myself being pulled away from them. The room began to spin, and I stumbled backwards, my mind reeling in disorientation. I tried to grasp onto something, anything to hold onto, but it was like trying to grasp a handful of sand. The harder I squeezed, the more it slipped through my fingers. The figure's eyes flared with an intense light, and I felt myself being drawn towards them. I stumbled forward, my feet carrying me across the room without any conscious direction. The air around me seemed to thicken and thicken, until it was like wading through molasses. I tried to cry out, but my voice was barely a whisper. Sophia and Marcus were still standing in front of the figure, their faces frozen in a mixture of awe and terror. They didn't seem to notice me anymore, or if they did, they weren't reacting. The world around me continued to distort and blur, until it was like looking through a funhouse mirror. I stumbled backwards, my hands grasping for something solid to hold onto, but everything seemed to be made of smoke and mirrors. I felt myself being pulled apart and put back together again, like a puzzle with pieces that didn't quite fit. The figure's face seemed to be the only constant in this chaotic world, its eyes fixed on mine with an unblinking gaze. I stumbled backwards, my mind reeling in confusion. What was real? What wasn't? I couldn't tell anymore. All I knew was that I was lost, and the only thing that seemed to be holding me together was the figure's gaze. It was like being trapped in a dream from which I couldn't wake up. The last thing I remembered was Sophia's voice, whispering something in my ear. But when I opened my eyes again, she wasn't there. And neither were Marcus or the figure. All that was left was the echo of her voice, echoing through the empty room like a ghost. As I stumbled backwards, the world around me seemed to collapse into chaos. The room began to spin and distort, like a carnival funhouse mirror reflecting my own terror. I felt like I was trapped in a never-ending nightmare, unable to wake up or escape. The figure's eyes continued to bore into mine, its gaze a cold, unyielding weight that crushed me beneath its intensity. I tried to scream, but my voice was lost in the void. The air seemed to thicken and grow heavy, like a physical presence that pressed down on me. I stumbled and fell, my body crashing against the cold floor with a sickening thud. As I looked up, I saw Sophia's face hovering above me, her eyes black as coal, her skin deathly pale. She spoke in a voice that was not her own, a voice that sent shivers down my spine. "You'll never escape the gardens," she whispered. "You'll never leave." I tried to struggle, but it was no use. My body felt heavy and unresponsive, like lead weights were attached to my limbs. I was trapped, unable to move or escape. The figure loomed over me, its presence filling the room with an unspeakable horror. I felt myself being pulled down into a deep, dark abyss, a void that seemed to stretch out forever. And then, everything went black. When I came to, I was standing in a garden, surrounded by twisted, nightmarish trees that seemed to reach out and grasp for me like skeletal fingers. The air was thick with the scent of decay and rot, and I knew that I was trapped in a world from which there was no escape. The figure stood before me, its eyes blazing with an otherworldly intensity. "Welcome to the gardens," it said, its voice a cold, mirthless laugh. "You'll stay here forever." And with that, the garden seemed to shift and writhe around me like a living thing. I stumbled forward, desperate to escape, but every step felt like taking a step into the abyss itself. I was trapped, unable to move or escape. The garden seemed to stretch on forever, a labyrinth of twisted corridors and dark, foreboding chambers. And in the center of it all, the figure waited for me, its eyes fixed on mine with an unspeakable malevolence. As I stumbled through the labyrinthine corridors of the gardens, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being led deeper into a trap. The figure's laughter echoed through the halls, its voice growing louder and more maniacal with every step. I tried to run, but my legs felt heavy and unresponsive, as if rooted to the spot. Suddenly, the walls around me began to shift and change, like a puzzle being rearranged. New doors appeared, leading off in different directions, each one beckoning me deeper into the heart of the gardens. I stumbled through them, blindly following the figure's lead. Finally, we arrived at a large, iron-reinforced door with a sign that read Project Erebus. The figure pushed it open, revealing a room filled with rows of steel cages, each one containing a person who had been subjected to unspeakable horrors. I saw faces that were twisted and distorted, eyes that bulged from their sockets, skin that was stretched taut over bones. It was a grim reminder of the true purpose behind the gardens, an experiment in human psychology and sanity. The figure led me deeper into the room, where a large, leather-bound book lay open on a table. The pages were filled with notes and diagrams, detailing the various methods used to break the human mind. I saw references to hypnosis, sensory deprivation, and even physical torture. It was a twisted game of cat and mouse, designed to push the human psyche to its limits. And at the center of it all was the figure, watching and waiting as I struggled to comprehend the true horror of what I had stumbled upon. I tried to scream, but my voice was drowned out by the sound of my own thoughts, racing through my mind like a madman's script. The figure leaned forward, its eyes blazing with an otherworldly intensity. "Welcome to your new home," it said, its voice dripping with malevolence. "You'll be our next subject." And with that, everything went black. When I came to, I was lying in one of the steel cages, my mind shattered by the horrors I had witnessed. The figure stood over me, its eyes gleaming with triumph. "You're just in time for dinner," it said, its voice dripping with sarcasm. And with that, everything went black once more.